Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم
I'm
السلام ورحمة
happy to
الله.
welcome Professor Muhammad Harun from South Africa, who is Director of International Relations of International Peace College of South Africa. Previously, he was associated with the University of Western Cape, University of Cape Town, and National University of Malaysia. He is the editor-in-chief of Duke University's Research Africa Reviews. He also serves as African Consortium of Law and Religion Studies board member. For 2 decades, from 2000 till 2020, he was attached to University of Botswana, where he moved up academic ranks to become a professor of religious studies. He published several works, and one of these was an annotated bibliography of Muslims in South Africa. This project has been going over the years, and he intends to produce an updated and enlarged volume towards the end of 2024. So let us talk about South African Islam, the Muslims of South Africa.
Okay.
Hope you will give some review on how Islam came over, what's the current situation.
Okay. No, thank you, Dr. Abbas, for this opportunity. I think there's lots to talk about, but we'll have to see what we can squeeze in. And there might be a number of issues that we might also be leaving on the side, but that we can always weigh up and see at if another occasion arises. But let me just give a brief socio-historical background because that sets a tone for the current generation and the generation to come. I think for many of us are now familiar with the fact that when we talk about South Africa's Muslim community, which is already diverse as we speak, but it's also partly to do with the historical aspects that added to this identity as it appears at present. So historically, the Muslim basically have links to two important sub-regions, if one can describe them as sub-regions. One is Southeast Asia and the other one is South Asia. And of course, we're talking about the period of colonialism when we talk about the time when they were basically taken from those specific regions to South Africa. But let's start with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, of course, as we know by now, it was then referred to as the Malayu Archipelago. So the names Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, these were non-existent at the time. But what we do know is that the Dutch colonial powers, alongside the Portuguese and British, they basically fought for these areas, and so there were amongst them rivalries. But that being the case, the Dutch had a strong hold over many of these areas, and as a result, there were also opposition from the locals. And interestingly, if we just look at two or three individuals such as Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassari, countered the colonial forces at the time. And of course, Jakarta, as we know today, was one of the important colonial outposts in that region. And as a result of its stranglehold over that region, it forced many individuals to go into exile. In other words, it took them from where they were in the Malayo Archipelago to nearby areas such as what is today known as, of course, Sri Lanka, but then known as Ceylon. But since the Dutch East India Company had managed to also take over the Cape of Good Hope, it felt that some of these individuals who really stood up against them, like Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassari, had to be exiled. And in that way, quite a number of exiles in other individuals who were enslaved and imprisoned were brought to the Cape. And this is where Sheikh Yusuf eventually landed in 1694. And of course, he and his entourage of 49 were thus forced out to an area known as, well, known as Makassar, not the Southeast Asian Makassar, but the South African Makassar. And this is also known as Zandvlei. So it was an outlying post far from what we know today as the city center. And that is where Sheikh Yusuf was and eventually died in 1699. But the point which I want to make with this sort of short story is the fact that Sheikh Yusuf was then and now seen as the founding father of this community. But he was not the only prominent individual. There were others, or even there are some archival sources indicate that there were other individuals, but they were less prominent. And of course, if we talk about Sheikh Yusuf, we know that apart from being a mujahid, somebody who stood up against the colonial powers, he himself was a person of religious clout. In other words, he had that religious influence over the community that he served, because he himself had written several manuscripts, and some of these have now, interestingly, appeared in publication form, translated into English by two South African scholars who coordinated this project. And so about 2 years ago, the University of South Africa's two scholars, Professor Yusuf Dado and Professor Uwais Rafiuddin, they edited a compilation of Sheikh Yusuf's writings. And I mention this not because they are important in terms of intellectual history, as well as influencing the Muslim thought down the centuries, subsequent centuries. So it gives us an interesting understanding and insight into how Sheikh Yusuf was able to understand his socio-political circumstances at the time, and at the same time provide advice to the communities that followed his ideas. But just a few extra thoughts about Sheikh Yusuf, just because we're not here to talk about him as such, but he had been trained and schooled in Arabia, of course, today known as Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Syria, Iraq. So, in other words, he was a well-rounded person in the sense that he was exposed to a number of schools at the time, but he absorbed all of those ideas and then transferred them into his writings. And so if you look at many of his writings, very much Sufi in orientation, but also in terms of that he basically influenced the thinking of the communities that he served back in the Southeast Asia or the Malayo archipelago. So he's just one of those interesting figures that were exiled. The other one came about slightly a few years later, or decades in a sense, was Qadi Abdul Salam. Abdullah ibn Qadi al-Salam was popularly referred to as Twanguru, and he himself did very interesting contributions in the sense that, first of all, he had written from memory the Quran, and so there are about 3 or 4 mushafs around that are attributed to him, and that in itself was inspirational to the local community. The second part to his life was establishing or laying the foundations for a masjid. And so if anybody visits Cape Town, they have to go to what is referred to as the Awal Masjid. And the Awal Masjid is the one that he basically set up. In other words, these are two important structures, that is the mushafs that he had written, as well as the masjid. And then the third to that was the madrasa. In other words, he laid foundations for madrasa education, and subsequent communities benefited from this. So these are just two examples. One can, of course, make reference to a few others, but this is the Southeast Asian influence that remained and from which we benefit. And from which many derive their sort of inspiration from, and many few families like the Abdurrahman family, the Rakib family, all of them take their lineage from this important sheikh known as Tuan Guru. The third individual whom perhaps I should mention is the Turkish scholar Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi. Now, why he becomes important is that, and by the way, perhaps I should have mentioned that Tuan Guru passed away in 1807, which meant that if you look at the time frame between Sheikh Yusuf and Tuan Guru, there was quite a long period gap. Then the third person to come to the scene, of course, as we said, there are a number of others, but these are the ones who left their imprint, was Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, and he was brought as a result of some negotiation between the Ottoman Sultan and the Queen of Britain, and of course the local authorities, because by then the British had been in charge of the Cape, not the Dutch, and there were certain religious squabbles that had been taking place, and they felt that the only way was to get somebody of standing, religious standing, to come out and resolve the issue. And Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi was then sort of brought to do that. So in 1860, when he came, he basically had to basically adjust to the situation that he found himself in, and then started to look at ways of how to sort of deal with this community. Interestingly, he was one who also came to learn Afrikaans language while he was here. So he himself was a polyglot. He would speak many languages apart from, of course, Arabic and Turkish and so forth. The outcome of his stay is basically he set up an institute for high learning. So that means that he added to the madrasa development, he added sort of a higher structure to that. That is one part of it. The second part of that, you also set up an institute for women, for the Muslim women to basically learn. But the third and most important contribution was his writing of the Bayanuddin. The Bayanuddin, as we know, is the clarification of religion, was basically a fiqh text. But what is interesting about this text compared to many others was that it was written in Arabic Afrikaans. So the Afrikaans that was spoken was then written in the Arabic script. And so in that sense, this Bayanuddin was written in Arabic Afrikaans using the Arabic script. But prior to him, by the way, Arabic Afrikaans was in circulation. There were manuscripts that were written, but why does his work stand out? It was published in Istanbul, and it was the first published text in Arabic Afrikaans. So in a sense, his contribution remains. It has continued up to this day, partly because there's a few Turkish scholars who have been writing about him, who have come to Cape Town, have explored it further, and of course who know Turkish. As such, they could extract information from archives to basically piece together his story that was somewhat known at the Cape, but there were lots of historical dimensions that were unknown. So these individuals, one can argue, were the pioneering figures of what we know today as Islam at the Cape or Islam in South Africa. Now, like we said, and of course, Tuan Guru and Sheikh Yusuf, they came from Southeast Asia. Now we have to, of course, and in between is the intervention of Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, that came from Turkey, so a different geographical location, but with a different sort of focus, of course, to try to resolve socio-religious issues at the Cape. But this brings me now to the second group, that historical group that were important. That is the South Asians. I call them South Asians. I don't want to call them Indians or Pakistanis because I don't think it is fair for us to box them in a very narrow sense. So we look at a broad geographical region. So as South Asians, they came, of course, as we know, the British colonized South Asia, and as a result of their presence, they then also found that the South Asians had certain skills that they could take along with them to South Africa, where the British also were in control of. And because the Indians had some of these skills, they were brought over as indentured laborers and working on sugar plantations, and in that way help to contribute towards the economy, control, of course, by the British. The interesting, since we're mentioning that, going back to the Cape, the economy was at one stage controlled by the Dutch and then by the British. And so there was a mixture that had emerged. And so, in a sense, the early Southeast Asian slaves also had skills in carpentry, in building, in plastering, and so forth. And they became the important sort of working class that contributed in a substantial way towards the building of the Cape. And of course, it was basically Dutch architecture, but in essence, if we look at who worked the grounds, they were the Southeast Asians. So I think those. So coming back then to the South Asians, they landed up in the southeast part of the country, Durban, in greater part of Durban, and of course went into the inner part of South Africa to Johannesburg, that is not along the coast. So in all of these cities, if you go back to many of these cities outside Johannesburg, many of them find themselves having lineage from South Asia, whether it is Punjabi, whether it is, from any of the other sort of areas, from Bengal and so forth. It demonstrates that these communities then are able to find their lineage back because many of them still speak the local languages, unlike the Cape where we have lost the ability to speak, say, the Bahasa. I want to use Bahasa in a broad sense because today we have Bahasa Indonesia as compared to Bahasa Malaysia, and they differ because of the sort of linguistic regions in which they're located. But that language has now disappeared, and so most of the people at the Cape would speak English and Afrikaans as compared to those along the South African's east coast. And of course, wherever Indians located themselves, where I say Indians from South Asia, they still speak many of the dialects, whether it is Mayman, whether it is Surti or whatever. So in that sense, but of course, the current generation, the younger generation, they seem to lose touch with this linguistic dimension, which is a pity because I think what has happened, just as a footnote, is that these languages have added value to these communities, to their identities, to the sort of richness of the Muslim community specifically. Of course, we know South Asians were not only Muslims; they were also Hindus, they were also Christian Indians. But it appears from the historical sources that many of these South Asian Muslims had a very influential they were very influential on the whole, and that makes it fascinating. Of course, the Hindus too, but there has been, as we all know, a rivalry also between the two. But the British used these groupings in their own interest in the way they felt was possible. And as a result of the South Asians having come, particularly the Muslims, they built, as we always see, masajids, madaris, and so there are a number of important figures that we can make reference to. But I think that is just in a very summarized, very rough way of describing the past, just to have an idea that where the ancestry of these current communities basically come from. But let's sort of fast track and get into the 20th century that lays the foundation for the 21st century. Because of these contributions, one therefore finds that the Muslim community's numbers also slowly increase over time. And as a result of their presence in, say, Greater Cape Town, Greater Durban, Greater Johannesburg, they are fairly prominent for example, in Johannesburg, Durban, in the business sector. In other words, if you want to look at any business, families, family businesses or individual businesses, we find that these these Indian Muslims basically had really entrenched themselves and made a mark. So nobody can, if you go even to small towns, whether it is Stanger or Brits, you'll find, for example, the early Muslim Indian families really made a mark. And that in itself continues to this very day, because you cannot ignore the histories of these towns without associating with the histories of these families. At the Cape, slightly different in a sense that most of because the Muslims here, their lineage is from South Asia with different skills. Of course, there were those who were also in business and so forth, but they were mainly in the building arena. So your carpenters, your bricklayers, your every sector that you think of in the building industry, they were the sort of main contributors, but also in sort of other industrial areas. But we're not going to go into all of that. But the point which you want to make is that they laid the necessary foundation for the 20th century community that was slowly emerging into a very conspicuous one, despite numerically small. And this is a point that we need to make even up to this day, that the Muslims, even if you look now into the 21st century, numerically they're small. Some would say 3 million, some would say a bit more, out of the 60 million plus in the population. But the interesting part, if we come to the present day period, is that, as we had said, these two groups come from South Asia and Southeast Asia. Their numbers have now been complemented by many immigrants or migrants who came from West Africa, from North Africa, from, of course, contemporary Bangladesh and Pakistani and Indians and Sri Lankans. So they have added to the identities of the locals, and particularly, of course, beefing up the Muslim numbers, but also beefing up the ethnic numbers in terms of, or rather nationalistic numbers, like your Pakistanis. If you go to Cape Town, you'll find a road filled with lots of barbers, and most of the barbers are either from Pakistan or India, depending who dominates sort of these areas. If you go to other areas, you'll find the same developments have taken with either the Indians as opposed to the Sri Lankans or as opposed to the Bangladeshis, all of them influencing the sort of the makeup of the Muslim community. So they have now since added to the numbers of the Muslims, in other words, in a way strengthening the numbers and thus adding value to it, but also maybe adding concern, so to speak, from within the Muslim, because they feel that now these new identities are bringing their cultures, their ideas to the Cape and clashing, or not just to Cape, but to Africa, in a sense, clashing with the locals. So there's that dimension too. We're not going to go into that, but I just want to mention that partly because that has become a reality. But besides these developments having taken place from those who have come in as migrants, those who have now settled communities, there's also another grouping that has slowly emerged to and become very interesting sort of polyput of identities, and this is the indigenous communities. Many have embraced Islam. They've now established themselves. Many of their youth or or young men and women, particularly men, have gone to Darul Ulooms, studied there, become imams, and so they've now become the new power brokers, so to speak, religious power brokers in the community. So those who used to belong, say, to the Jamiatul Ulama or the Muslim Judicial Council, they now have to contend with these groupings who have now become influential in terms of the religious ideas and the religious negotiations, because there are internal conflicts. And so these are sort of new developments, of course, that little has been written about, but attempts have been made to basically write these communities in. But added to that, I mentioned early on that from amongst the migrants who have come in, the West Africans have come in big numbers, Nigerians, Senegalese, There are Mauritanians, few handful. There are Moroccans who have come in. There are Algerians who have come in. Egyptians in big numbers. And what this adds now is a really new dimension to Muslim identity formation. Because Egyptians have come in to do business here. Moroccans have come also to do business, but they also have other ties, religious ties. And in that way, there is interesting developments, subtle developments that we are not fully informed about as social historians, because we're trying to gather, of course, on the one hand, we're trying to write about the Muslim as such, their history, their makeup, and so forth. But with the additions, these migrants coming in, it just adds an interesting dimension to it, because now we need to assess what type of religious influence have sort of entered into our space. For example, the early Muslim communities were mainly Shafi'i and Hanafi from purely madhabi perspective. All of a sudden now, we have to deal with the Hanbalis, who were basically absent from our sort of socio-geographical space, and all of a sudden now they become part of the space, and how do you accommodate them? And so that, from purely religious angle, is something that the Muslim community is grappling with to an extent. They've of course accommodated them, knowing the sort of vibrancy within the or the presence of these schools, but at the same time also trying to understand how do they deal with Hanbali school as opposed to and of course sorry, the Hanbalis and the Malikis, sorry. Of course the Hanbalis also have come because of the Saudi Arabian influences, but the Malikis have now become a major school as compared to, say, the Shafis, who were always there, who remain there, and the Hanafis. So and of course many Senegalese, Mauritanians, Moroccans, and so forth, they belong to the Malikis, and they have now established enclaves, if one can describe it as such, within the Muslim community, and thus add new dimension. But perhaps I should also add as another footnote the Ithna Ashari, the Shias. The Shia influence are very minimalistic, if I can describe it in that way, but they're also present. And this was partly due to the post 1979 revolution in Iran, because since then, Muslims within the community, of course, they decided, some of them, small numbers, decided to convert from Sunni to Shia, others attaching themselves to the Ithna Ashari. My understanding, interpretation basically would be that they themselves weren't fully aware of the divisions within the Shia society themselves. They weren't fully informed about the Ismailis vis-a-vis the Ithna Ashari and all the other little groups that exist. But they were very much inspired by the revolution, and as a result, they held on to that over time. And so we have a few, of course, Shias, not necessarily born, they were basically converted and grew up with that sort of type of Shia thinking, or the Ithna Ashari thinking, and therefore have close ties with the Iranians and such. But like we said, because of the prominent Sunni presence, the Shias really cannot dent, so to speak, or make major inroads. Although they have their own masajids in certain areas. In Cape, they have one major structure, masjid in the community, that are very badly, if I may describe them that way, attended. In other words, they do not have lots of congregants who go there for Jumu'ah and so forth, partly because of the anti-Shia vibe that is present. The same happens in Durban, where there's one in the outside Durban itself, and the same can be said for Johannesburg. So in terms of theological identities and fiqh identities, there are these sort of aspects that are there, but the Sunnis as such are the more Sunnis in a broad sense, not again, as we all know, within the Sunni Al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah grouping. There's also the Sunni, that is more associated with the Braillevi school vis-a-vis the Deobandi school, that have also spilled over from South Asia into our community. So we have to also have to contend with those divisions. So as you have now heard, there are different layers of divisions, from purely fiqh dimension to the basic Sunni Deobandi Braillevi division, and then added to that, you have the Shias now coming in with their sort of understanding and interpretations of aspects of Islam, and this sort of adds to a degree perhaps to the richness of the dynamic dimensions of the community. But I think it's a very interesting to basically now look at this community from outside in, to see to what extent it has, first of all, numerically expanded. Secondly, in terms of their presence, you'll find in the Greater Cape Town, wherever you go, you have halal outfits or restaurants and so forth. What does that basically mean? It means that Muslims seem to have a very interesting influence in terms of the commercial sector, particularly the food industry, because everything that you find in the market, many of the things are basically have halal stamps on them, whether it is the Muslim Judicial Council Halal Trust, or whether you have Sanha, South African Halal Association, or whether you have any other, because we have a number of such bodies that try to regulate the halal sector. But what it tells us is how influential they've become, because whether it is a major supermarket such as your Pick and Pay or Spar, all of them realize that they have to have halal products on the shelves in order to really make business. If they don't have, they realize themselves to be in a situation where they might not really be able to really make good business if they didn't accommodate sort of the halal industry sector, in their supermarket and so forth. So there's sort of that dimension that we have. So in other words, talking about economics, I think the Muslim community have been relatively, if I may use that word, influential. Let me just mention firstly, like we said earlier on, many of the Greater Cape Townian Muslims, they were skilled in the business arena. Sorry, in the building arena. So if you needed a bricklayer, you get somebody from the Muslim. Of course, this has changed by now, by the way, but you found yourself in a situation where most of them, or the individuals who were in the industry, were from the Cape Muslim community. So if you wanted a carpenter, you go to that community in order to get a good carpenter. Of course, things have changed, as we had mentioned, but they still dominate the scene, the building industry, in sort of different ways. Some of them have become major building contractors. Others, of course, remain small, but their presence are still conspicuous. As we had mentioned earlier on, because of this Indians' presence, South Asians, of course, now in terms of nationalities, Pakistan, so forth, they've also stood out with businesses, import-export market really booming between South Asia and South Africa, and they become your sort of major players, business persons. The local businesses have always flourished, have been there, whether it's material business, whether it is hardware stores and so forth. You'll find that these business people, many of them being Muslims, have therefore contributed towards the economy in their little ways as such. So on the whole, purely from an economic angle, they have become prominent. But what is interesting now is that as over time, particularly in late 20th century, when many of the Muslim communities became more economically mobile, what did this basically mean? It meant that many of the earlier generation never went to university or completed school, and so they encouraged their kids to go to university, of course, paying for their fees and so on. But what happened at that generation, now we're talking about 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that many of them specialized into engineering, into medical practice, into legal studies, into commercial studies, becoming major accountants in the area. And as a result of these new specializations, they dominate those areas as well. Dominate despite the numerical sort of weakness in terms of our, when we look at Muslim numbers, saying we're 3 million. So the 3 million, from amongst, that 3 million, there are those who specialize in these areas. So today we can find Muslim specialists in almost every sector that we can think of that is listed. That if we talk about the nuclear physicists, we have Muslims who are nuclear physicists. If we talk about in engineering sector, whether it's quantity surveyors, whether it is sort of electric engineers, whether it is any other engineering sector, you will have a Muslim, and either a Muslim company or a Muslim architect who really have paved the way for himself or herself, because there are many Muslim women also in the area, and they have, in a sense, really added value to our identity as Muslims. So when we talk about the commercial or rather accountancy sector, these days you have Muslim asset management companies, partly because they realize there's an opportunity to make inroads in that sector. And for example, we have in the Cape, we have Oasis Management, a company that is a fully Muslim-owned family company. And as a result of their influence and spread, because they all have offices in Ireland, in Dubai, and so forth, we demonstrate that they have now gone beyond South African borders and made a mark for themselves and made, open up pathway for them. But then the same happens in the medical fraternity. We have a Muslim business person who started out selling records in the 1970s, and he set up several branches of Malumed, as he called himself, hospitals and clinics. And so in the Cape, if you go anywhere, any area, you'll find Malumed hospitals, partly because is basically owned by Muslims and have become very influential in the medical sector. So I'm just giving these two examples of how individuals have spread their wings, managed to establish themselves, and have become influential players in certain areas. So we can look at other areas as well and find Muslims having made their mark. Let's sort of go into the political arena. The same has happened there. We have, for example, currently a very small party known as Al Jamaa Party, led by a Cape Townian born individual who, by the way, whose forefather, his great grandfather, who had come from Mauritius, landed up in South Africa. Uzair Ali is his name, and he was a friend of Gandhi and was also concerned with the position of Indians in South Africa. Of course, discrimination against South Asians had been rife. The British, of course, having used that, and so he's basically the great grandson of this individual, and he established this political party. So this political party has been, despite their smallness, has managed to capture the sort of the political scene on behalf of the Muslim community. Of course, not all Muslims identify with it, partly because of their own, not just theological differences, but their differences on politics and so forth, because many still lean towards the African National Congress, as opposed to as opposed to the Democratic Alliance, that is a white-dominated party that have also a number of Muslims in it supporting it. But about this party, it is not well, it's the first party that managed to get a foot into parliament. There were, prior to it, two other Muslim parties that contested since 1994, the African Muslim Party, as well as the Islamic Party, which basically really couldn't get off. But the African Muslim Party did and also contested, but only found its way into local councils and not into parliament. So politically, there's also been these developments that have taken place. But what is important to note that when South Africa became a democracy way back in 1994, we basically had a situation in which many Muslims identified with ANC policies. They were members of the ANC. They were members from Konto Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. So in that way, they became very influential as politicians. And of course, over time, they basically retired and moved out. And some of them, of course, like, for example, Minister Abdullah Omar, known as Dala Omar, he was the first Muslim Minister of Justice of the country. So, and currently we have Minister Ibrahim Patel, who was Minister of Economic Affairs of the country. So some of them continue to play a very important role within government circles, within the political arena, and there are still a few Muslim politicians that are active across the political parties. So different political parties have Muslims amongst their ranks. So they remain players, but as I mentioned, Al Jamaa as now is the only Muslim political party that has become what is described as a platform for all. So you don't have, it's a Muslim party, but it has also a number of Christians who have now become its councillors. There are at least 3 Christian who are Africans, interestingly, who are the sort of political representatives as councillors. Interestingly, is that the executive mayor of Johannesburg, Councillor Capello Guamanda, is from the Al Jamaa party, and he's a Christian, though. So in a sense, what this tells us is that the Al Jamaa party, despite its smallness, so to speak, as a political party, it seems to be influential in certain circles, and the African National Congress seems to have a working relationship with the party. Not that they are attached to one another, or that Al Jamaa is a part of it. It is separate of it, but it works with it where the need arises. So in other words, where it feels that it can work, why not? Is the question. So politically, then we sort of see that this party has specifically, but also Muslim politicians have made their mark over time and in different ways. Let me quickly just comment on the educational arena. I think even in this sector, Muslims, whether it is in the schooling sector, high school, primary school, preschool, Muslim educationists have played a very vital role. As we mentioned at the beginning when we said that when Tuan Guru established the madrasa, it somewhat set the tone for what was to come. Many of the generations that emerged then emerged out of these madaris. So what did this basically mean? That the issue of education was stressed and emphasized, and Muslim families encouraged their children to become hafiz or to learn basics by going to these madaris. But as time went by, particularly by the beginning of the 19th century, there was a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Abdurrahman, known Abdurrahman, if we pronounce it correctly. And Dr. Abdurrahman basically set up several what we call Muslim mission schools along the lines of Christian mission schools. And the reason for those primary schools were basically to educate Muslims about, to basically expose the Muslim child to secular education as well, besides Muslim education. So as a result of that, many emerged out of these schools, they graduated from these schools, and then subsequently went to high school and subsequently went to university or training college, teacher training colleges. And as a result of that development, there are those who eventually not just became teachers, but who became principals. So up to now, unfortunately, sadly, we can't give you a survey or a list of names to say there are so many Muslim principals at schools, in other words, who are running schools at the moment, but who are also principals who have now passed on. So in other words, we can list an enormous number. And what does that also tell us? It tells us that Muslims were educationally extremely active, and they made their contributions in several ways. And to this very day, we find some of them have moved up into academic arena. And even in this sector, many have gone into different fields, whether the humanities, whether the engineering. So you find, if you should survey the universities that exist, that there are many Muslim academics around who have made their mark. And this in itself tells us the story of the evolution of the Muslim community, that they never sort of got stuck into remaining at one level, but they move across the different disciplines and into different sort of areas and made their mark and made their contribution. So if we, and in fact, some of them also became vice chancellors of universities. There's a Professor Bellum, for example, who had made his mark at least two, 3 universities, part because of the skills he imparted. He had great administrative skills and therefore was acknowledged by the department, by the Minister of Higher Education, and was asked to basically sort of take charge of certain universities that had problems. So what this tells us is that the story, by the way, of many of these individuals haven't been told as yet, even though attempts are being made to encourage them to write their own histories. But this has not really happened as we would like to, partly because if they did so, and if they do that, I think it will give us a bigger picture of who the Muslims communities are, from where they came, why they made the contribution they did. But I hope, though, that attempts have been made to give broad outlines of the Muslim community in terms of highlighting many of these areas that we sort of had mentioned. But I think what we found just alongside that, besides the academics that we're talking about, there have been a few books that have been written by many Muslim authors, whether it is creative writing, novels and short stories and so on, or poetry, which has also been an issue that has not really been taken note of by academic studies for some reason or other. But despite that, I think their writings are there to be looked at, to be assessed, to be evaluated. So we need to encourage some young academics to really look into that and to write it up. Not to say that nothing has been written. There have been writings, but I think substantial research need to be done to really give it a full-blown treatment and understanding, so that we have a better insight as to who this community is. I think as I'm talking and sharing ideas with you, I am doing so by giving you snippets of this the social history, which I think is not satisfactory in any way, and that's why we need many other voices to add to the story, to give their insight, to give the interpretation. And I think if that happens, then we will get a far better insight into who this Muslim community is. Just to give you another example, of course, we spoke about education, mentioned politics, we spoke about certain families and sort of individuals who made their input. But there's just as a matter of interest, recently, a few months ago, there was a Zuleika Mayat who was died in the 90s. And why I mention her name, she comes from Durban, and she has been one of those. She was a journalist, she was a radio commentator and so forth, and so multi-skilled in the lady, but who also made a mark in the cuisine area. So she wrote a book known as an Indian cookbook, and that was written way back in the 1970s or 60s, late 60s. Of course, she compiled, but in the 1970s, and that book always was a standard text for anyone wishing to do Indian cooking. But of course, many other books came onto the market now, competing with it. and taking space. But what I sort of about this lady, she became an iconic figure in the socio-cultural Muslim affairs in Durban. And as a result of her emphasizing Muslim identity alongside Indian identity, and more specifically, the inter-ethnic identity, whether Surti or Maiman or whatever, I think she made a mark in that sort of sector, partly because she understood and appreciated the need to reinforce his identities, not to basically show that we are different from the other, but to highlight the contributions that this community has made and continues to make, and why it's important to write about the community. She didn't write a biography, unfortunately, but there have been a scholar by the name of Ghulam Vaid, who has written an enormous amount um, on the Muslims in that area in KwaZulu-Natal, in Durban. And I think somebody who should be consulted in terms of you want to have a different understanding of the Muslim community. But I think just aside, coming back to Mrs. Zulekha Mayat, I think she has become really an iconic figure within that community, and that in itself is something that we cannot sort of ignore. So we need to. What this shows was that there are these Muslim individuals who really made a mark to such a point that you cannot ignore their presence, even though in the post death period, if you have to write about Durban Muslims, her name needs to be inserted somewhere and highlighted, partly because of the contribution she made. And so, of course, there are many other individuals that we can, but let me um, talk about the sporting sector as well. I think many of us uh, have heard maybe of certain names in the sporting arena. Hashim Amla, who has been an outstanding South African cricketer, young man, still very much relatively young, who basically made who had an enormous impact upon the cricketing community, partly because of the centuries he scored, but more so because of the way he carried himself as a Muslim. As some of us know that all the sporting arenas, they normally supported with lots of funds from certain sectors, from the wine industry, for example. And so in the end, you've got to wear the South African badge, the cricket badge, along with the sponsor. And he had made an agreement with this that he is, does not, or should not, he be given the opportunity not to wear the badge of the wine industry because he does not identify, and they respected that. I think in the post-apartheid period, of course, there was a lot of there's still a lot of openness, and as a result, he's sort of managed to do that. But he's just one example. But let me just go a bit back historically. At the Cape, for example, the Muslims at the Cape, if you look at the makeup, you find that families were associated with certain sporting codes. The rugby, for example, and cricket, two important sporting codes that forms part of the Cape Muslim makeup. So you had families like the Majid family. I'm just giving an example. You had all the brothers who were involved in sport, either rugby or cricket or both. And even today, as we speak, they're still very much involved in managing clubs that are associated with the family and extended families, and of course the community. And so, but what is interesting about the Cape community as compared to the Durban community is that if you belong to a rugby club, of course, I'm talking about the past, early 20th century, even before, and into sort of, or throughout the 20th century, then you were involved also in a dhikr group. You were involved in a choir group. In other words, they call it a Malay choir. So in other words, your family is not just involved as a family in one sporting category, but there are also other cultural activities. So they would be involved, as we said, in the Malay choir, or they would revolve in the dhikr jamaat, as they would sort of refer to them, or of course crudely described as khadat jama'ah. The word khadat meaning, khajats, so the religious needful activities. So there was an interconnectedness between the rugby club as sporting, the cultural club, the religious activity, and they were associated with a particular masjid. And in that way, you could find that the identity of the community was somewhat not just monitored but was regulated through these. So any child who basically was born in that community would be associated with a particular rugby club, with a particular cricket club, with a particular khadat or hajat group, or a particular cultural group. And in that way, the identity. So when there's marriage, when there's birth, when there's death, you'll find these communities come together. So there's lots of structures that reinforce one another, and that in itself still operates today, but not as it used to. So there are, of course, different challenges as we find ourselves in at present, social, political, economic, and so forth. But in essence, and a way to round up is that all of these, and if you look at it from outside in, and you look at the historical evolution of this community, you find different structures sort of reinforced it. But you also find that with new challenges, that the community has now to adapt to new developments. And as part of this conclusion, I want to say that the Muslim community also delve into the media sector. So they have their own radio stations, community radio stations. They've got their own Muslim newspapers, whether they come out on a monthly basis. The point of the fact is that they contributed to the media industry in a very dynamic way, and we're not going to go sort of into that for now. But at present, we have at least more than 5 Muslim radio stations around the country. And what does that basically mean? It means that these radio stations have kept Muslim community informed about their identity, informed about who they are, and I say how, in which way, through the programs that they have, through the type of information that they relay. And at the moment, you and I know, and we all know that the Palestinian issue is a major issue. And so when you go to any of these radio stations, they'll always be talking about the anti-Zionist stance that they've taken up, and of course, and then the pro-Palestinian position that they hold, and why they need to reinforce that Palestinian identity, so to speak, as an extension of their Muslim identity. Of course, knowing the Palestinians there are also pockets of Christians there too, but it's also a story that they try to reinvent or reinforce interreligious dialogue within our communities. So they would argue that churches have been bombed, and so as Muslims, we also sympathize and empathize and give them support, but they also want the local Christian community to also assist them in fighting the Zionists, because Zionist influence have become rampant. And so your Cape Union Mart as outlets, as your Discam outlets, all of these are Zionist owned companies, and they need to be sort of spoken out against, because they send money to the Zionist state. And in that way, the media then has become a very important conduit by the information has been relayed, and that have been reinforcing the Muslim identity across not just South Africa, but also in the region, because many of these are available via cyberspace. So you can pick them up anywhere. And I think many have now identified with Muslim radio stations, and that in itself has become a very exciting area of specialization, which Muslims never had before 1994. So these are all new developments that have been taking place. And of course, as we said, lots of challenges. I think that's sort of a mouthful, Dr. Abbas. So
Yeah, great. Great to
yeah.
hear that, especially giving wonderful idea on South African Islam, and it has a confluence of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and African. And I think we need to talk more about the Black Muslims that developed recently over there, and also maybe the involvement of Muslims, especially your father case, he sacrificed his life for the freedom of the South Africa. I think we'll have another opportunity to talk on this. Thank you so much for
No, inshallah.
joining us
Thanks for
and
this
giving a
opportunity.
remarkable outlook on Islam in South Africa.
Okay. Well, thanks to you for this opportunity, and hopefully we can continue a conversation on another occasion, looking specific issues rather than a broad overview as we try to do. Not satisfactory though, but an attempt was made to at least give some idea of who this Muslim community really is.
Yeah,
Tashakkur.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah. Wa alaikum.